The Rundown, Part 23, a Farlost story by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by one, by two, by three. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
One window of Councillor Underwood's glass-walled penthouse office was filled with his larger-than-life, sorrowful face. "Tonight I am deeply saddened by my city. My fellow Lochlavians, have we really let hatred of the system guard become such a cancer in our hearts? I ask every voice in Lochlaw to join with mine and denounce the killers who have struck in our city, using the same utter disregard for human life they claim the guard has shown us." A fragile smile broke through on the image of Underwood's weary face. "I beg you, show the cowards we are better than this." A chair smashed into the wall, spiderwebbing the glass. The flesh and blood Bennett Underwood stormed across the room, picked up his chair, and slammed it into the window display again. This time, shards of glass showered down and skittered across the floor. "How did this happen?" Bennett turned to rage at Martin Ladouceur, face and bald head a mottled red. "How did that system guard cockroach survive?" he roared, kicking the chair across the floor to slam into the side of his desk. "Never pegged Yates to serve and protect the consul so hard," agreed Martin with a sleepy nod of his head. "Literally threw the consul out of the blast radius. The goal was to take the guard out of the negotiations, force them into honoring whatever we made the flunkies under Tarquis sign, after we vaporized everyone with authority," Underwood growled. His fingers tore at his elegant tie knot, betraying his frustration. "I'd rather that puppet Tarquis had survived than Gomer Sol. Any other surprises I need to know about?" "None," Martin answered in a bored. "Any other surprises I need to know about?" "None," Martin answered in a bored tone, staring at something on the inside of his spectacles. "Our Patsy worked in a power station clear across the city. Gambling debt tracks back years." Martin leaned against the transparent glass cylinder housing Bennett's private elevator in the middle of the nearly empty room. "Someone working for Cree bought the debt. Same someone rented him a room in Metro and got him a new slate. A slate that received exactly one message before it got slagged with its owner. That someone is also dead, yes?" Underwood growled, staring at the ruined window. Martin nodded again. "Shot and killed in his own home after transferring a sizable fortune to the bomber's widow and children." Martin's fingers barely twitched, but Underwood knew him well enough to know the insides of his eerily lit glasses displayed the cover story he'd arranged for the bomber, and for Cree's recently deceased money man. "There's a few layers of shell corporations for the cops to tear through, but when they chase down the bomber, they'll end up at Cree's door." Underwood's shoulders finally released. "Well then, not a total loss, is it?" He turned to face Martin, his face beginning to break into a smile. "This won't destroy Cree, but it's a good start down that road, especially when the Haven delegation make their tearful declaration that it was Cree who summoned their leader to his death." "Which they will," Martin agreed, his eyes almost visible behind his dark gray glasses as he tracked a carrier across the skyline, visible through the office's 360-degree windows. "We've heard him. And now he's desperate. He'll make his own mistakes." That happy thought erased the last of the rage from Underwood's face. He walked back to his desk and recovered his jacket, slipping it on. "Our tin can friend will take care of both jobs tonight." Martin pushed off the side of the elevator, waving his hand to open the doors. "Yeah, he got the message." "Well then," Underwood said, his face forming into a mask of weariness and resolve, "let's get back to the negotiations. We owe it to our fallen comrades to see things through." "Sure we do," Martin chuckled, following his boss into the elevator car. It was pitch-black night in Peartown by the time Nick and Donald passed the last working surveillance tower. The sky was spitting rain, and the streets were an inky sea between the few light posts they passed before Nic took his first easy breath. No longer worrying about hiding his face from machines, he stood a little taller and let the anger return to his face. He unconsciously patted the thigh pocket of the loose black pants he'd gotten from Farley and the red-haired cop. The sensor-proof bag and the little vial inside were still there. "Where are we going?" Tyzan asked beside him, in a voice only slightly louder than the softly pattering rain. Nic had been aware of the liaison officer's silence, which continued until Nic's body language had relaxed. "A place my father took me once. Didn't think I'd ever have to, but—" His voice trailed off. He didn't know what his next move would cost him, but he'd pay it. He wasn't going to lose anyone else because of Roland Bird and his mysterious benefactors. Tyzan's eyes scanned all around, a sensible precaution in this neck of the woods, Nic thought. His quiet voice was suspicious as he pressed for more information. "What kind of place?" "A place where you can trade for what you need," Usher replied, "if you have the right currency." "People are trying to kill us, Inspector," Tyzan said. "I'm sore, I'm tired, and I'd appreciate a straighter answer." Nic flashed Tyzan a weak grin. "Look, you were right when you said the law in Locklaw works differently depending on who needs it. We're going to see someone who can get things done when the law can't." Tyzan shook his head. The glory of democracy. Usher shrugged his shoulders as a trickle of rain made its way under his shirt. "I'm just starting to like you. Can we hold off on the ideological boxing match?" Tyzan grunted and remained silent through the next block. Nic had changed the way he walked as soon as the last of the surveillance sensors were behind him. He had experienced working undercover without the protection of a badge. He knew there were eyes watching him from shadows and curtained windows. Only the right amount of swagger, the right amount of attitude in his face, would keep them from trying to make a meal of him. He looked back to Tyzan and saw the guard officer had learned the same lesson. His massive, normally graceful frame was now hulking, arms swinging. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck raise. The guard officer always looked imposing, but with his new aggressive stance, he looked like a monster. Nic looked away, doubly happy he'd never laid the punch he'd been meaning to since Tyzan had appeared in his hospital room. Everybody in Farlost came from somewhere else. Everybody had to fight for what they have. But the Sky Cities are the ones that lost everything. Twice. Maybe, in a way, even states annexed by the Guard can't understand. Nic kept his eyes moving, scanning for trouble. "We were slaves," he murmured. The dragons had taken everything from Locklaw, from Nic. The tears that had ruled them had killed his mother and broken his brother. "My mother died because her output wasn't worth what drugs would cost, according to the tears. My brother Ben just gave up after that. He vowed not to give the tears any more of his output after that, and—" Usher swallowed. "Ben jumped off the city wall." Tyzan said nothing. The only sound came from the rain. "I was just a kid, barely old enough to chase trouble, but I did. Dared the tears to beat on me, fell in with black market traders looking for kids too young to draw attention. My father didn't know what to do to stop me after losing both our mom and Ben." Nic forgot about the night's pressures and fell into a rhythm of telling the story, a story he seldom shared with anyone. He'd been a smuggler before he'd married my mom. When she passed, he got angry. Same as me. But he channeled that into working with rebels, smuggling people marked for death by the tears out in Willer, and flying in drugs like the kind his wife had needed and couldn't get. Guess that saved him. Still nothing from Tyzan, except the heavy presence of his attention. Nic went on with the tale. It got him deep into the rebellion before the rebellion even knew what it was. Nic almost laughed, imagining what it must have felt like resisting the dragons and the tears, with no hope of ever making more than a dent or saving a handful of lives from being ground out. Then came the Guard offensive, Tyzan guessed. Nic nodded. System Guard missiles took out the sky roads, isolating the cities. Surgical strikes destroyed communications and defenses, killed half the tiers and a bunch of dragons. The Civil War started overnight. We controlled Locklaw in a matter of days, but as the Guard drove the tiers to completely abandon other cities, they tried to retake ours. Nic looked around, taking in the mixture of centuries-old buildings and prefabricated ones lining both sides of the street. There wasn't a building without a hole in it before we controlled the city, and a lot more holes before the tiers were all rounded up. He turned right at the next intersection. Tyzan fell in silently behind him. The real turning point was when the gangs and organized crime threw in with us. The tiers might have wiped out the rebels if someone hadn't convinced the people making a killing by, killing, that there was more money to be made rebuilding society than propping up the dragons and the tiers. Nic cast a sidelong glance at his traveling companion. Come on, criminal empires being the deciding factor in the survival of democracy? I was sure you'd have a field day with that. Tyzan shook his head. Crime is everywhere, he said, his voice taking on a softer tone, even on Academy Rock in the heart of the Guard. There's a story there, Nic guessed, intrigued. Perhaps best told another time. Tyzan's eyes glinted as he nodded. So, who convinced the crime lords to throw in with your resistance? Right, sure, another time. Nic was annoyed. He discovered he really wanted to hear about Tyzan's past, but he shelved his curiosity and continued telling the story of his own. Fortunately for the resistance, the tiers were corrupt, and the dragons loved their courtroom intrigue, so there were plenty of bad guys. So many competing criminal elements, in fact, they needed someone to help solve problems before they burned down everyone's houses. That someone still kicking, an old hide named Ada, with a soft spot for human hosts. And that's where we're going, Tyzan realized. That's where we're going, Nic confirmed. The story goes that Ada was here when they built the Sky Cities. Some say he helped broker the treaties between dragon clans that led to the creation of the cities in the first place. And he's been the guy that everybody wielding power has trusted with their secrets, trusted to avoid the worst of wars since then. Nic stopped walking and pointed a finger at a 4-story building ahead. If it wasn't for Ada and the Roadhouse, my dad told me the rebellion and the crime bosses would have never hammered out a deal in time to round up the tiers and fight off the Guard. The building was old, laid stone, carved and poured permacrete, a dog's dinner of a dozen different architectural styles, with 3 stories of modern floor-to-ceiling windows sandwiched in between. The Roadhouse? Tyzan asked. The Roadhouse. And you trust this Ada to help us get Bird? Nic shrugged. I'm a cop, Tyzan. Ada and the Roadhouse are way out of my league. But I'm out of moves, and my dad trusted Ada. He told me more than once he'd seen Ada balance things for everyone, make the city better, stronger. He looked up into the dark night. Hope you were right, Dad. Nic swallowed hard and started across the street. Donald ran a hand through his wet hair as they approached the 2 Skanen bouncers manning the door of the Roadhouse. He felt good. That worried him. Donald was a cop, a lawmaker, a peacekeeper. But he had a soldier inside of him. A wolf, always ready to fight. In the last few hours, he'd been shot at. He'd taken on superior numbers, under fire, and adding insult to injury, he'd been stunned and cuffed. Why was he smiling? Why was he happy? Was he anticipating more violence? Was the wolf licking his chops in anticipation? Or was it Usher? The man's grudging respect and growing acceptance. Either way, he told himself, remember where you are. Foreign soil. Among people who would kill you for the sun medallion you serve. Hunting your brother's killer. The world came into clearer focus, and the energy and excitement surging through him calmed. Ready now, he followed Usher up the stairs. The Skanen let them in. Tossed them in, more like, with coarse chitinous digits, possibly to remind the two human alpha males to be on their best behavior. Donald allowed the push and found himself in a dark room. The music was loud, but he'd heard worse. The crowd was unruly, but he'd seen worse. The first floor seemed to be comprised of shift workers and cargo movers from local pier operations. There was a dance floor in the center of the room, but it was covered with more tables. There was a wide rectangular opening running the center length of the building, revealing the second floor. Usher looked around, scanning for the way upstairs. Donald found it on the far wall, near several set of species-specific bathroom doors. The two men started forward, but several more massive Skanen bouncers appeared, mandibles clacking, both sets of upper arms crossed in that age-old tough guy pose. The closest bouncer shook his head, pointed to the bar. Donald looked down at his tight shirt, half soaked from the rain. He wouldn't have let himself in the front door, let alone upstairs. Even from here he could see the second floor was made up of finer clothing and a better class of drinker. He turned to Usher and raised an eyebrow, silently asking, "What now?" The inspector was looking around, considering, when his eyes caught something on the second floor. His frown deepened, but he wandered to the middle of the room. Tyzan followed. His eyebrow cocked again when Usher grabbed an empty shot glass from one of the tables. Empty or not, the fat bearded man at that table started to his feet, face fierce and tracking Usher. Tyzan pushed him back down hard. The man wasn't a weakling by half, but Tyzan had put a lot of power into shoving him back down, probably more than the man had felt applied against him in a long time. That, or the fierce grin Tyzan flashed the man, convinced him to stay sat down. There was a little more wolf than there should have been in that smile, and Tyzan worked to pen the animal again as he followed Usher to the center of the room, following the inspector's gaze to the second floor. Usher lobbed the shot glass in a high arc, intersecting with the animated head of a manta deep in conversation with a crowd of smiling, wide-eyed sentients. The manta whirled, eyeballs wide. The crowd of people roared, but the object of their attention settled them quickly and swooped down with a few powerful wing beats. "Evening, officer," the manta said coolly, one tip of his twin tails rubbing the spot on his head where the shot glass had introduced itself. "Can I help you with something?" "Evening, Jarvie," Usher replied. "I could use an introduction." Tyzan was disgusted listening to the manta, a reporter named Jarvie, and the inspector, Haggle. They finally agreed on something Tyzan couldn't hear, and then the manta waved both men to follow him back to the tiles leading upstairs. At a word from the reporter, the bouncers melted away, and Tyzan followed the reporter and Usher up the incline of morphing sliding tiles. A sound curtain muted the music halfway up the incline. "I'm happy to do my civic duty, Usher, but if you welch," Usher put his hands up. "2 scoops, I promise. Nothing that will compromise an ongoing investigation, and nothing that will reveal the identities of any undercover officers, but you'll get your scoops." The manta looked back at Tyzan and smiled with his flat, wide mouth. The air sacs dotting his back along the spine inflated, and Jarvie rose in the air until a large fart expelled some gas, and he dropped back to shoulder height beside the inspector. Tyzan's eyes watered from the smell. He wondered if the scent was a manta insult or the stink of a cocky reporter who'd got one up on a cop source. "Let's start now. Tyson's here to find Bird. Are you searching for leads here in the Roadhouse? Does that mean you suspect an underworld connection in the terrorist's escape from custody?" Jarvie," Usher growled. "Nothing about ongoing investigations. You agreed to those terms." The manta's wings and tails all whipped at once, petulantly. "Yeah, fine, okay. Let's go find our host." The tiles rolled Tyzan and Usher onto the second floor, and the manta beat his wings to take the lead. They followed him across the room to the far corner, where another set of bouncers were spoken to, and another set of tiles traversed. The ceiling of the second floor was solid, no view of what lay upstairs this time. Halfway to the third floor, Usher turned the questions on Jarvie. "What have you got on the bombing that killed General Tarquis's party?" Usher, I know you don't do a lot of deals with the press, but me telling you stuff isn't how favors work. Tyzan reached out and wrapped one of the manta's tails around his fist twice and pulled. Hey, hey! The manta squeaked, his voice rising an octave and another fart sending hot air Tyzan's way. I heard a couple of things, the manta said. Let go, I'll tell you. Tyzan let go. The manta whipped around, pushing his tails out of Tyzan's reach. His face contorted, and Tyzan narrowed his eyes, expecting some trash talk from the reporter, but none came. The look on Jarvie's face softened, and he just stared a moment. Sorry. I mean, what happened to your brother? Tyzan hadn't expected that, and he was at a loss for words as the tiles pushed them onto the third floor. Thank you, he managed as he followed Usher and Jarvie into the middle of the room to an empty table near a long, beautiful wooden bar stretching from the back wall to well over a third of the way through the room. The walls all displayed content, but privacy shields blurred the views for all but their intended viewers. The flickering images were not accompanied by sound. A woman came up to take their order. Get us Ada, Jarvie said bluntly. She gave the manta a quizzical expression, but nodded silently and walked away. So, the bombing? Usher prompted. Jarvie wrapped his tails around the chair on the other side of Usher from where Travis sat and pulled himself to seated eye level. It's weird, Usher. I'm hearing from sources there's a paper trail back to Cree. The counselor who faced off against Underwood? Tyzan asked. Usher nodded. Jarvie farted. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Tyzan asked, seeing the puzzlement on the inspector's face. Usher chewed his lips. Cree's danced in and out of police investigation a few times. Like Underwood, he's got a lot of skin in the shipping business. Unlike Underwood, he hasn't put any legwork into making deals with Haven SG if the negotiations are successful. He shook his head. I can see him maybe getting dirty to try and stop the deal. It'll cost him millions. But no way he'd be so sloppy, Jarvie finished for the inspector. He's been at this game way too long to leave this much stink on any of his moves. You think your counselor Cree is being set up? Tyzan realized. Usher nodded. A figure in a red cloak appeared behind Usher. It was wet from the rain. Mr. Jarvie, said a soft voice from beneath the cloak, I don't believe you've ever summoned me before. Usher was turning in his seat as slender hands drew back the cloak. He froze, half-turned, when he saw the face that belonged to the voice. Jane? He asked, voice hollow and hoarse with shock. The woman was beautiful. Her black hair, shaven along the left temple, long and swept over her right eye, her chin strong and pronounced. She backed up a step, eyes widening with shock. Nic? She gasped. Nic jumped out of his seat. Tyzan stood too. Jane, he knew that name. As in former partner Jane Kelly, he wondered. He was still connecting the dots when the red cloak rippled and whipped, and the woman's fist connected with Nic Usher's chin. Tyzan was glad he'd stood to exchange greetings with the woman when Nic landed on the table. It cracked and collapsed under him. Tyzan turned to face Jane, falling into a combat stance, but completely unprepared. She was already in motion. A kick to his solar plexus sent him backwards. He absorbed what he could of the blow, but fell to one knee. Spillane! She shouted, and jumped on Usher, kicking him back flat to the floor again. She fell on him, knees on either side of his chest. You let them take me! She screamed, and landed a left on his face. She followed it up with a right. Tyzan acted, lifting the slender woman off Usher. Miss Kelly, please! His facility for words disappeared when the back of her head slammed into his nose. He dropped her and staggered backwards, again finding his combat stance but shaking away stars from his vision this time. Nic was on his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. Jane, She lashed out with a shriek and a kick. Even prepared, Nic barely deflected the side of her foot and ended up back down on one knee again. Tyzan knew he was smiling when he sprang at her, ready for her defensive block this time. He parried the block and swept her legs. She leapt over his front leg, dancing back out of reach when he grabbed for her. Then she was smiling too. Tyzan felt the wolf howling in his blood as he dodged her first lithe kick, then grabbed her spinning leg beneath his arm, holding it tight to his chest and pinning her arms to her sides with his. Her breath was hot in his face as she struggled, immobilized. Bright lights blinded him. "Let him go," a deep Skanen voice boomed. Heavy pounding feet surrounded him on all sides. Tyzan blinked, his vision coming back, to see a Skanen in a long black jacket holding one gun to Usher's head and pointing another at him. "Let them go," the Skanen roared again, enraged. A circle of bouncers, all armed with pistols or rifles, had appeared around them. Tyzan was confused. He wasn't holding him. He looked back at Jane, felt her struggling, and realized he was still smiling as he restrained her. He wasn't sure, but he thought Jane was trying hard to resist a smile of her own. That was only one of several emotions flashing across her face, however. Her glare darted back to the Skanen with a gun to Usher's head. "Don't shoot, Spillane!" she shouted. Then her face looked past Usher and the Skanen covering him, fixing on one of the displays on the wall. Tyzan looked where she looked and froze. Jane wriggled out of his grip and pushed him away the moment his attention was broken. There on the screen was a smiling Roland Bird. "Sound on, Window 5, Jane shouted. "The system guard cannot be trusted. Haven SG cannot be trusted. I speak for the many voices in this city who know there can be no peace anywhere until System Guard is gone." Nic got to his feet, staring incredulously at the window. Spillane, the Skanen, only pointed the gun away from the inspector when Jane, again, angrily waved him off. Then all eyes turned to the window display. "I fight for all of you who say no to letting the system guard get their claws into Locklaw. Voices this city government ignores so they can profit from what's coming." Jarvie farted so hard he blew halfway to the ceiling. "What voices? What the hell is he talking about?" "I fought for you tonight, people of Locklaw, when I vaporized the system guard's lapdog, General Lehman Tarquis, and this is only the beginning." The larger-than-life image of Roland Bird smiled a psychotic smile. "I urge you all to stand with me. Make your voices heard. Fight with me, Locklaw, until every sun medallion is melted to slag and every guard dog is dead. It's time to resist again, Locklaw. Make your voices heard and let the counselors tremble in their ivory towers." Roland winked at the camera. "You'll see me again, real soon." The window flared white, and the hateful face disappeared, leaving clear glass in its place. Tyzan only realized how fast his chest was rising and falling when he started to see stars and feel dizzy. He closed his eyes and wrestled the wolf and the hurt and the hate back down deep. "I'll get him, Sala," Tyzan swore. When he opened his eyes, no one had moved a single step. He stared at Jane. Jane stared at Nic. Nic stared at the window. It took him a couple of tries to remember how to form words. What the hell just happened? You have been listening to The Rundown, a Farlost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.